Hello, everyone. It's great to see everyone and join everyone on this webinar. I'd like to introduce our guest today, Marilee Springer. She serves as the outside general counsel to clients, providing concierge level service to tax-exempt organizations, social impact entities, donors, and quasi-governmental entities. Marilee focuses on corporate, governance, tax, and structuring issues, and her clients are served by lawyers across the Faegre Drinker platform. In the social impact space, Marilee frequently advises clients on corporate social responsibility programs, social impact investments, and sophisticated grants and mission-related investments. Marilee, we are honored and privileged to have you join us today, so thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So to kind of jump right in, can you tell us about some of the changes that have occurred recently that organizations should be aware of?
Yeah, so wow, it's been a whirlwind the last 5 or 6 weeks for sure. And I think every day that we wake up, the landscape is shifting, and it's shifting for us personally, it's shifting for our companies, and our state and local and federal governmental authorities are just trying as quickly as they can to get ahead of the impacts to us and our companies and really the economy.
Absolutely. It's a whole new landscape. We certainly haven't been in this situation before. And so non-for-profits and donors and philanthropists find themselves, as you have said, in this, what do I do? How do I respond? The laws are changing continually, constantly, and literally 24 hours later, there's something new that is revealed. So again, I certainly appreciate your position in walking with those that are living in generosity. What ways are you seeing organizations and donors use kind of the emergency assistant programs that are now available?
Yeah. So, right now for our charities, they are the safety net for our communities. And the government has done as much as quickly as they can, but much of what they're doing is constrained by the existing infrastructure that was there and the funding models that were there, so they can push more money for healthcare. But what's happening is our nonprofits, as the safety net, they're stepping into the gap of the things that are happening every day in their community quicker than the government is ever going to be able to catch up with. And some examples that I would give you would be, it was the right decision to close our schools, public, charter, private schools, and send our kids home. But not all of the children had the same ability to have technology and internet and things like that when they got to their homes. And so government can't solve that, but charities have stepped into it. And so here in Indianapolis, an emergency assistance fund was set up, and millions of dollars were placed into there, and there's a formal relationship between the funding and IPS schools here in Indianapolis, because we have to get laptops and internet into the schools so that all of our children have the same opportunity to continue quality educational outcomes. And so that's an example of something where there was a real, human need in our communities, and philanthropy had to step into it really, really quickly. Another example would be daycare. Who would have predicted 6 weeks ago that all of the daycares would close? But our healthcare workers still need access to daycare. And so if all of the providers are closed, somebody's going to have to create and staff and manage healthcare or daycare so that we can keep our healthcare workers going to work to protect us every day. And so those are kind of two examples of where nonprofits and philanthropy have stepped into the gap. And what I have seen is that in the past, companies had employee assistance programs or relief funds. And sometimes those funds were run by the company, but more often they were run by either a public charity or a private foundation, which kind of sat there. And if an employee had a hardship or they had a need, then they could apply for funds from the employee assistance program. And you saw that if their house burned down or if their spouse was diagnosed with cancer. Sometimes you would see it in an entire community. Flooding would occur, and the community would need to come behind a whole group of people who had lost their homes and all of their belongings. And so there was kind of a body of law out there that allowed financial relief to be provided through emergency assistance. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as an employee assistance fund. You could also hear them referred to as an emergency assistance fund, or sometimes you'll just hear relief fund. And when you hear that, what that really is, no matter what term we use, it's a situation where philanthropy and grant dollars come into a fund, and individuals can apply for relief from that fund. And, you know, generally when things are wonderful, charities don't usually make grants to individuals. They don't write checks to individuals. They don't give food debit cards to individuals. But when you see a situation like this, then somebody has to step into the middle of that. And that means a charity is writing a check, is giving cash, is giving a loaded food card to an individual. And right now, when you see the unemployment rates at the levels that you see them in the entire service industry sidelines, then you know that the demand for that type of one-on-one individual employee assistance is just skyrocketing. So that's kind of gives you a little bit of, so those employee assistance funds or emergency relief funds, they always sat there. And so I think one of the questions that we could talk about today is for the people who are listening, for the charities that are listening, can they create one of these funds? Are there funds that are available that they can send donors to? How can they meet the needs of both their employees and the members of their charitable class, the community that they're specifically trying to serve? Is that homeless? You know, is that underemployed? Is that medically fragile? Is that disabled populations? So many charitable classes out there with people in the middle of them that need emergency assistance today, and they can't wait. The federal government hasn't found them yet. They haven't identified a program that meets their needs, and they're going to need help quicker than the government, federal, state, or local can get to them.
Absolutely. And so obviously under the national kind of emergency declaration, as you said, those private foundations can now provide financial relief support. What are some of the major eligibility requirements or things that an organization needs to put in place at a high level to be able to start implementing some of these resources?
Right. So President Trump issued an emergency declaration, and when he did, what that means is now public charities, private foundations, corporate foundations, donor advised funds, all of them can provide this assistance directly to individuals. And that's important because in the past, only public charities could do that. And so now any form of charity, including private foundation and donor advised fund, can make payments into or establish one of these relief funds. And so when you look at eligibility and selection, first of all, you know, you have to have a qualified disaster. And we know we have that because President Trump issued the emergency declaration. The payments have to be for qualified disaster relief payments, and those are defined to include reasonable and necessary personal, family, living, or unfortunately funeral expenses incurred as the result of a disaster. And so the reasonable and necessary personal and family and living expenses is fairly broad. And so that's going to include almost anything that a family in need has right now. And there's a couple of things that can't be included. And so first of all, you can't make a payment for something that is going to be covered by insurance or reimbursed by another party. And you can't provide full income replacement payments. And so this, if there's an employee that is laid off, furloughed, terminated, you can't just replace their income. You can make a grant to them, but it can't be in place of the responsibility that the employer had to provide that compensation. So for the workforces, there's some nuances there. And that means when we're talking through those, you can see that there's going to need to be an application process, and it's very much simplified. It can be a one-page application, but we're going to have to understand I have these needs, and I can tell you that my expenses exceed this dollar amount, and they're directly connected with COVID-19. And so there's going to be an application process and a vetting process. And the good news is that it's greatly simplified. So when you are not in this type of an emergency situation, you probably would need to review tax returns and bank statements and things like that. And those rules have been suspended. And so we can rely upon a certification of the employee, for example, certification of a member of the charitable class. Maybe there's a list of things that they need help with, and they can check the box. And then they can certify, I had expenses that were extraordinary and they exceeded this threshold. But there are definitely some parameters around how you create that program and how you vet and select the recipients.
That's a pretty powerful change, Marilee, as you think about, what, again, as you referenced, traditionally those employee assistance programs that we all kind of have a perception on and disability. I know as we've talked about some things, you've seen some examples that might help organizations understand how these changes and tools and instruments might be used to benefit, particularly if they're a direct service provider. What are some of those ways and examples that you've seen this utilized in the best way?
Yeah, so a couple of examples that I would give you. One of the examples is an organization that provided housing in a multi-state area, and their residents needed assistance. And so, they have their housing and that's secure, but one or both of the members of the household lost their job as a result of this. And so they need help with groceries. They need help with medications. They need help with a lot of things. And so the company put together a relief fund for the residents, and they could apply for that assistance. Okay. Another great example was we worked with an association, and they have members all over the United States. And the members themselves have had to lay off employees, and employees have lost their jobs. And so instead of every single company needing to create a relief fund, we can create a relief fund for the association, and then all of the companies can send their members to a single relief fund. And that's really powerful. If you can do this with more than, across an industry or with a coalition of charities, then it makes it less expensive to create the infrastructure or, to fund it. And you can have one unified set of parameters, and you can send lots of organizations and people through it. And so, I think that we've seen these emergency relief funds be utilized in very creative ways to meet the needs either of an employment base, like a workforce of employees, or a charitable class that we know we can define.
Wow. So if you had a donor, would they be able to make or provide a gift to an organization for qualified kind of disaster relief payments? So they had a non-for-profit, and what they've had to reduce the hours of individual, and for whatever reason they did not get in the application for the Payroll Protection Act, or it has not come in yet. And obviously those on the front ride, they need some financial assistance, and a donor wants to be able to help them. Could they make a gift specifically for kind of an EAP purpose?
Yeah. So first of all, you said something important, Paycheck Protection Program. So employers are applying for those funds, and they're utilizing them to secure the jobs of their employees. But that may not solve all of the issues that are in that household. So that worker may have a spouse, and the spouse lost their job. So now their income has dropped to 50% of the level that it was. And so their employee's family may have needs that are, they kept their paycheck. It's wonderful that they stayed employed. That's a blessing. That's a privilege. But that probably didn't solve all the issues going on in the family. So the Employee Assistance Program, the EAP, can kick in and meet some of the other needs because of the sizable drop of income that the family experienced. So that's one of the uses with it. So going back to your question about the donor. And so company owners or high net worth donors, frankly, any donor, they can help employees of a company today with dollars that they gave away last year or 5 years or 10 years ago. And that's really one of the true beauties of the EAP right now is it allows a business owner, sometimes they didn't realize that they could utilize the dollars that they gave away and put away in a 501c3 to benefit the workforce today, and they can. And so they're managing the balance sheet of their company, and they're seeing their revenues fall at a time when they really need to keep the employees on the payroll. And so they're so focused on the balance sheet of the company that sometimes they need a reminder, hey, do you have dollars in a private foundation? Do you have dollars in a corporate foundation? Do you have dollars in a donor advised fund? If so, those dollars are actually available to help the workforce today. And so then the next question is, who can create an EAP? And so public charities have always been able to create these type of relief funds. So if you're watching and you're a public charity, you have the ability to create a relief fund today. And that could be for the benefit of your employees if it's a large enough class, or it can be for the benefit of your charitable class, meaning, you know, if you are a community development corporation, for example, and you blanket a specific geographical area, it could be for families that live within your service area. If you're a public charity, you have the ability before COVID, and you have the ability now. The expanded rights to do this are really for private foundations, corporate foundations, donor advised funds. And there, the advice that we've been giving is this emergency declaration isn't going to live forever. And so your right to do it now is more expanded than it will be once President Trump revokes the emergency declaration. And you can hear him speak. He's not going to keep this for very long. And so we know he wants to reopen the economy. And so if you're a private foundation or you're a donor advised fund, you have a donor who has dollars there, then my recommendation would be maybe not to create the fund yourself, but to find a public charity or another third-party administrator who can create that program for you. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I wouldn't want to see a private foundation or a donor advised fund have the cost and the expense and the time to create it, and then a couple of weeks or a month from now find out they don't have the authority to administer it anymore. But if those dollars come from a private foundation or a donor advised fund today, and they go into some type of a public charity, then they can keep going all year. Because I think we all know that the human needs and the suffering, they're going to last longer than the emergency declaration. So if President Trump lifts it next week, or he lifts it in May, or he lifts it in June, all of us think that the consequences to people and our communities and our economy are going to last much longer. And so, you know, I think I would recommend that if you're a private foundation or a donor advised fund, that you consider aligning your program with a public charity, utilizing your dollars today. Get those dollars out, get them, you know, directly deployed into the economy, into your charitable class. But maybe don't build it yourself, because once the dollars are deployed, they're there forever. And they can serve the needs that are going to be longer than the emergency declaration exists.
So obviously, as we have individuals that are listening to this webinar from the East Coast to the West Coast, and everyone in between, and of all sizes of budgets, if they're listening and they wanted to move forward with this, broadly speaking, how long would it take to establish that? To move in that direction? Obviously, your firm could do that, but broadly speaking, are we talking, oh, this is going to take 3 or 4 weeks to move in this direction, and the declaration could be rescinded by that point? Or are you saying that this could be implemented relatively easy, it's not super complex, within a week or two?
So creating it from scratch requires, first of all, that if you're a charity, it requires that your board adopt an emergency assistance program. So you're going to have a board resolution, and attached to that are going to be programmatic documents. And those programmatic documents are going to say, these are the parameters of our fund. This is who we're willing to benefit. This is the minimum and maximum payments we'll make. These are the criteria through which you will qualify for the aid. This is how we'll pay it. Here's our application, and here's our approval process. So those are programmatic and infrastructure documents. Those need to be created, which really frame and define the eligibility for the program and how it will be managed. And then that goes to your board, and your board adopts it. And then the next thing is, do you have the staff to implement it? Do you have the staff that can vet the applications, do the fiscal analysis that needs to be done to qualify, and actually and physically make those payments? My thought is that if you're creating it from scratch, there's going to be time to educate, you know, your board, and to engage counsel to help you. And so I'm thinking, if you're creating it from scratch, you're probably looking at a 3 to 4 week window to get that program up and running. And that's pretty optimistic, because these conversations, like, should we do this? Is it strategic? Should we be doing it ourselves? Should we do it with someone else? Those are difficult questions. And so I think to create it from scratch, I would say 3 to 4 weeks. The legal stuff's easy. Like, we've done this before. That's not the difficult part. The creating it isn't the difficult. It's the human element of asking yourself the question, is this the right thing to do? And should we be doing it? Do we have the staff to do it? Or should we be hiring somebody else to do it? Because the second alternative is there are great third-party administrators of these programs, and they are themselves public charities. And so because they are public charities, what they really are is they are an aggregate of a whole bunch, sometimes hundreds of these relief funds. And together they are one charity. And so they have the staff, they have they have an online portal. And so it's really purchasing a third-party solution. And, I think that's probably something that you could get up in a week or two. I know we've had clients that have worked with some of those third-party administrators, and they've come up pretty quickly. And then you've got this online process, and you send a link to your employees or your charitable class, and they go in and they do everything online. And the selection and the vetting and the award and the check writing is all done by the third party. And so I think that, if I were working with an organization, I would really have them focus on, is this something that is, for us, is going to have a life for our organization that outlives this disaster?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is yes, consider building it. But if you believe that your strategy and your reason for being in this is this year, then I would probably be considering utilizing another public charity that can third-party administer the fund. Just frankly, this is Marilee Springer's opinion. This is me just being personal with y'all. I don't think there are enough organizations in our communities that provide this service today. And I've been doing this. I've been a 501c3 lawyer for 24 years now, and I've lived through a lot of crisis. I remember 2008, 2009, the market crash. I've seen tornadoes. I've seen amazing flooding, and we have these conversations, and we know that there's demand for this type of relief fund in our local communities. So that we don't have to be having this conversation a month from now. It's up and running and ready to make these grants. And unfortunately, for most of our communities, it just doesn't exist. So I do think that it would be a really positive and impactful and strategic decision for a nonprofit board to say, you know what, this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. We knew our community needed this, and we're just going to step up and we're going to do it, because this may be what we need in 2020, but we want to be here every time this happens in our community. We want to be the organization that our people and our families can come to when my community's in crisis. And so I do think that there could be a real strategic reason for community-based nonprofits to create this and run it and manage it within their communities if they have the capacity to do that.
Anything in particular that we didn't cover, Marilee, that organizations ought to know, whether that's in conversation with potential or prospective donors, or just as they, again, I think you've done an excellent job of covering sort of the what and the how and the who, and do you find a partner who already does this? But anything that we didn't touch on that is important for organizations to know or to consider?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is whenever you're creating an employee assistance program or emergency relief fund, there has to be a large enough class that it is a true charitable class that is anonymous in nature. And what that means is, if you're an employer and you have 10 employees, you're probably not going to be able to do this, because when you get the application, you're going to be like, hey, that's Bob, or that's Sally, or you need. And so when you say charitable class, we're talking a couple hundred or more. We're not talking small. We're talking the charitable class that's served by the relief fund needs to be large enough that first of all, it's anonymous. And second of all, not everybody is going to qualify. And so some people are going to get a yes and some people are going to get a no. And so think large charitable class. And the second thing is that you can't have the rules of private benefit and private inurement and conflict of interest and things like that. They doubly apply here. And so, first of all, if the fund is going to be created for the benefit of a company or a specific nonprofit's workforce, then the decision-making process on who gets the dollars has to be independent. And what that means is independent selection committee that's not controlled by the people who are going to be receiving the benefit or their employees. And so in the employment context, usually corporations will set it up and they cannot control the selection process. And so they'll look at trusted community members that believe in the company and their employees, but the selection process needs to be independent. And so, you know, you have to make sure that you don't have people that are making funding decisions that are related to the recipient or even frankly knowledgeable of them. And so that's kind of a couple of the guardrails. Sometimes that leads smaller organizations to one of these third-party solutions because either their employment group or charitable class isn't big enough on its own, and so they can't satisfy that independence requirement. And the other thing is when you move to one of the third-party administrators, once you set the criteria, everybody who meets them gets funding. And so that selection process is independent of you. That's good and bad. You're not in control of the funding decisions, but you are independent. So, and then the final thing I would say is, then the good news was that last night the House of Representatives passed the fourth coronavirus relief bills in less than 2 months. So the federal funding coming into our communities is now at $2.7 trillion. And the aid package that was passed last night is about $484 billion. And in that, there is another $310 billion in lending authority under the Paycheck Protection Program. So for those nonprofits who did not make it in before the money was exhausted, there is another $310 billion in aid for them, and that's great. And then there was $75 billion in relief for hospitals and $25 billion specifically designated for virus testing, because we know that one of the biggest barriers to us going back to work and getting the economy restarted is everybody having access to virus testing. So $25 billion of it was designated to flow through to state and local testing facilities. So that's good news.
Yep.
It's never going to solve all the problems, and I personally believe philanthropy, it's closest to our people, and the solution that is closest to our people is the one that's going to be most impactful to our communities. And so I'm just hugely thankful for our nonprofits that we have that are stepping into that gap and meeting the needs of our families and our communities in a way that our government isn't going to be able to do.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. You certainly know the information, and I know those that are going to be listening and watching are going to certainly benefit from everything that you have shared. I just want to remind everybody that this is not to be construed as legal counsel. This is purely your thoughts, your wisdom, your insight, your perspective that you are sharing that people can use as a resource as they move forward. So hopefully, maybe again, we can have you on as the new changes come into effect, and that you can again share your perspectives and your wisdom as we go forward. So thank you
for having me. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.